joining us this afternoon. I'm extremely happy to be with you all today because there's a few minutes this week where I didn't think I'd make it here. I flew in this morning from Montreal. I live in the West Island, if you're familiar with Montreal, and that's where we had some pretty sort of terrible floods over the weekend. So my basement's finished, and I got a couple of feet of water in there, and lugging out carpets and all that kind of stuff, and children's photo albums and all that. So I feel a bit guilty being here with you all today while they're still doing that, but I'm really happy to be with happy folks in a clean, dry environment. This is awesome, right? I should begin by pointing out that I'm not a scientist. You folks, in this room probably have tremendous expertise in that space. I won't pretend to be a scientist in any way, shape, or form. I'm a trade policy guy. I spent the last 30 years or so involved in the international trade of agri-food commodities, very specifically helping create and serve global value chains, food value chains, right? And I was invited to speak about traceability, and I wanted to put that in that context that I'm not a scientist. I end up working in the food safety space as it pertains to trade policy issues, so maybe a different perspective than some of you may be familiar with. And if I were to describe my role in that context for our conversation today, my nerdy little expertise is evaluating and then seizing upon opportunities or risk where international trade law and regulation intersects with supply chain practices. So that's kind of the perspective that I've come to you on this traceability discussion. Now, this audience is super sophisticated about traceability, and you will certainly understand as food safety professionals that traceability is not limited to the physical movement of product, right? That it's not simply about chain of custody, but within many of your organizations, when it comes outside of the food safety department and it talks to your legal team or your insurance folks or business commercial folks, traceability often gets lumped into this whole idea of being about the physical movement of product. So I want to kind of dispel that and kind of make sure we're talking about a wider discussion on visibility. And also, I'm hoping, if I'm successful at the end of our time today, that I can pivot towards making a suggestion how we can look at making sure that food safety performance matters. And what I mean by that is there is tremendous ongoing competitive advantage to folks who are non-compliant. And in the environment they're in right now, and what we've heard from CFIA today and earlier, maybe there's an opportunity, and I'll give you one example what I mean by that. Without further ado then, if I'm using the clicker correctly, and point number one, I'm not using the clicker correctly. Might be off. Nothing like a little performance problem. My daughter would be super impressed. Do I just slide it? And I'm wasting time with not being able to turn on the clicker. Yeah, could I use your expertise? Appreciate that. Thanks. I'm also going to share with you a couple examples of Canadian supply chains. Beautiful. Where traceability is obviously key, but the system failed, and give you some food for thought. And I'm going to take you through work that we're doing along with others at the American Frozen Food Institute towards seeing how supply chain practices, visibility, can look to mitigate enteric virus risks in the supply chain. So I'll try to cover all of that with the time that we have. I won't dwell on this too much, only to point out that this audience is super sophisticated and appreciates that traceability is not just about the physical movement of product. Traceability, if you only think of it in terms as the physical movement of goods, that may not give you enough information as to where risk is actually taking place. That's pretty straightforward, and you folks would appreciate that. Nothing revolutionary here. This is just a 360-degree diagram on visibility and what we need to know about that. Now, I'm not suggesting any one person in this room as food safety professionals needs to have this level of complete knowledge of everything, but you ought to be asking yourself, does your organization have that level of visibility and understanding? And I'll stick with just a couple points, three, to show you the complexity. Supplier identity and contracting party. Right? I see lots of master supply agreements from very large food companies, and it always surprises me that quite often they haven't contemplated situations that their businesses are part of. They haven't contemplated situations where the contracting party that they have is not the manufacturer of the goods, right? And they quite often confuse this magical word supplier, and it gets tossed around. Who is your supplier? What is the supplier? Right? Are we talking about the factory? Are we talking about the vendor? And who's signing these agreements, and who's best placed to ensure that the food safety oversight you're anticipating to have is being respected? Regulated parties, number three. Well, let's think it's something really simple. Beautiful Canadian organic frozen carrots sold to an American buyer for the last 20, 30 years. right? One of the beauties of being close to the United States is we have access to this incredibly important market, the world's largest economy, 10 times our population. But the curse, if I can say that, of being located to that market is we're kind of dependent and lazy sometimes as Canadian exporters, especially because of free trade, or thanks to free trade. Many food companies that I've worked with the last 30 years or so have completely failed to appreciate the border as a thing, right? Quite often, food companies who've never had an issue treat the border as an afterthought. We ship the goods, they weren't denied entry, we didn't pay any duties or taxes, it must have been compliant, right? I don't want to be too sarcastic, but I bet there are containers in the port of Montreal right now laden with narcotics, and if they don't get stopped and they get delivered to the GTA, I don't think anyone's going to say that they were compliant, right? It's a little bit of a over-the-top exaggeration, but it's not a really difference of kind. In the context of moving those beautiful Canadian organic carrots to the United States, you need a customs importer, that's a regulated party, right? And of course we have FSMA. And FSMA, you have to have the FSVP importer. It's unfortunate they didn't call it the FDA importer, that'd be a whole lot easier for folks to recall, right? And then of course you've got the organic importer. It's another regulated party by way of the Strengthening Organic Enforcement Act. Those three regulated parties are defined differently. The Canadian company can be an importer in the United States, a non-resident importer. That's how a lot of companies in this room may have been operating. The FDA importer must and can only be a US person. Non-resident importers are verboten. You cannot be a Canadian company and be the FSVP importer. And that's a challenge for a whole lot of folks, and many folks have put out workarounds that haven't been tested by the courts yet, and they're up for some challenges. And then you got the organic importer. Right, that importer is defined as the operation responsible for accepting organic agricultural products within the United States and for ensuring that NOP import certificate data is transmitted to CBP, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The important point of that definition is it doesn't say US operation, it says operation. And so Canadian companies can be the US organic importer. And that fits with the overall model of how business works, especially in the United States. Right? In the United States, first and foremost, quite often, the way that the supply chains function is predicated upon reverse sequential product liability or risk transfer. If you're an American buyer, you want to get that liability jammed way up the supply chain away from you as far as possible. That's your core goal. And thanks to NAFTA, thanks to USMCA, that's been readily possible. Right? Historically, if you were a Canadian company operating as a non-resident importer, many American companies just think of it as a weird domestic transaction, just with a longer driveway, right? Goods are coming from Mississauga or Ontario, Mississauga or Ohio, they don't really care, right? They're not the importer, delivered right to their door. That's how trade with the United States has functioned. But then FSMA, FDA, someone's got to be the FDA importer, and many US buyers refuse to take that liability. Again, they want to put liability upstream as far as possible. So that's a challenge. And then of course the organic importer, as I mentioned, again, a lot of US buyers don't want to be the organic importer. But that weird definition that allows for Canadian companies to be the organic importer, that's caused a whole lot of confusion for folks. Folks in Canada who may be core certified, like Canada Organic Regime, US and Canada have an equivalency agreement, that's fine for your factory. That's not okay for your importer status. As a Canadian company, if you want to be the organic importer, you have to be NOP certified. Core certification doesn't matter, it doesn't work. You'll notice I haven't talked about any real food safety issues. I've only been talking about liability and regulatory risk, right? And that's it. I haven't even talked about real food safety work. That just gives you an idea of the complexity about visibility, but that's the level of visibility that our food companies must have. And I'm not going to go all the way around the wheel, but you get the point. In the interest of time, I'm going to kind of skip over this because I got a little overly caffeinated when I did these slides and I got a little excited. But because in the interest of time, I wanted to share with you a visual representation of a risk management model that I've found really beneficial for myself, and it's the Kerplunk risk management model. Kerplunk is not a think tank in Bavaria, it's a children's game, right? Some of you may remember playing it. It's a cylinder, perforations all along the midway point, marbles on top, you put sticks through, and you get a multi-layered lattice, right? And what's interesting about that game, if you've never played it, is as you pull sticks out, eventually, if enough sticks come out, the marbles fall. But what's really interesting as a child playing that game is you'll notice very quickly that you can take a lot of sticks out, and the marbles don't fall all the way. In fact, the marbles become reinforcing to the system. They kind of lean on each other and block the marbles above, right? And if you put that into a food safety supply chain context, think of the sticks as stakeholders in your supply chain. Think of the marbles as food safety, public trust, market access, right? If there are enough failures in the system, it will collapse. And by collapse, I mean collapse of public trust, collapse of market access, et cetera. So I won't go into a whole lot of details because I had a bunch of slides on that, but I hope this maybe provides you all some food for thought, because I really want to get into two examples where traceability is super important, but it failed. I was directly involved in this issue back in 2019. China stopped accepting Canadian pork for a while. Massive problem, huge costs to a very vital part of our economy. The Canadian pork sector is a major part of the Canadian meat industry. The Canadian meat industry is a massive employer in Canada. Canada's far more employment. Canada's meat sector is far more reliant on international trade than our trading partners. If I'm not mistaken, I think our red meat sector is 80% reliant on foreign markets. And China is a massive, important market for Canadian pork. So what happened? Well, important to note that the trade of meat is predicated upon the issuance of original meat inspection certificates. Meat folks in the room will know what that is, an OMIC issued by CFIA. Trade with China specifically not only requires the paper certificate, right, but it also has a double kind of two-factor validation step. On an ongoing basis, Ottawa transmits the OMIC data to Beijing. Now, back in 2019, when this came about, the cadence was about every couple of weeks. I don't know what it is today, but that was the cadence. So every 2 weeks, there'd be a data dump from CFIA of OMIC data to Beijing. And the reason that's important is when the containers arrive in China, the paper certificate has to match what's in the system in Beijing, right? Easy peasy, right? Another additional point of context is that Canada is able to benefit from trade with China because while China has a Paleine ractopamine-free residue requirement, that's a feed additive for those who aren't familiar with it. It's used in production of pork towards rapidly gaining lean muscle meat, and then it's weaned off, et cetera, et cetera. Many markets do have a residue tolerance, but not China. And so Canada has a very sophisticated traceability requirement, a Paleine-free traceability program, tremendous amounts of work that go into that, right? So what happened here? Well, shipments that arrived in China with the right certificate that matched what was in the system, cleared customs, cleared food safety, but then did go on for subsequent testing. And they were found to be positive for Paleine. So did companies fail in doing their jobs? No, what actually happened is bad actors infiltrated the certification system. The cargo never left Canada. It wasn't Canadian product. It was product from some third country that went to some other third country and put into containers and shipped to China. Those of us that had access to the container number could see that, as did the RCMP, and as did others who investigated this. This was not Canadian product. All that traceability work, and I don't mean to in any way malign the incredible work that CFIA does. As exporters, we are incredibly fortunate to have the skilled folks that we have at CFIA and the work that they do, because of course that's what allows our trading partners to have the overall faith they do in the safety of our products. But in this particular case, something happened. I don't have time to get into it right now, but the certification system was compromised by bad actors. And there were companies that did everything correctly, played by the rules, did all the traceability requirements, and it all meant nothing, right, until that was fixed. I'll skip that. Interesting organic scam. So this is from back in 2020. I was really surprised at first that we didn't get more about this. It wasn't more of a story here in Canada, but you may recall we were dealing with other things back in 2020. It was kind of this wasn't the most important thing on the news cycle. What happened here was Chinese conventional frozen raspberries were shipped to Chile. In Chile, they were put into retail bags, private label for a Canadian retailer. The berries magically became organic, and they were exported to Canada in that retailer's packaging. And this happened for a period of a couple of years, about $12 million worth of raspberries, according to this article. This article is really interesting because there's just the straight word version, and then there's also this interactive map for anyone who's really nerdy and wants to see trade flows and all that kind of stuff. It's pretty cool. So what happened here? Straight up fraud, right? And so traceability in the organic sector, super important, obviously, right? A couple of years of product entering the market. I gather they were all sold in Canada. I gather folks who paid for it paid a premium for organic, thinking it was organic Chilean when it was conventional Chinese. That's a problem, right? So how did it get caught? Was it the import provisions? Was it certifiers doing in-out mass balances? No, it was whistleblower, right? It was somebody in Chile, Chile is a super important supplier of these same products. That party in Chile realized that it would be really detrimental to them if something went sideways, the reputation, right? So they advised the Chilean authorities who did the investigation. So here's it's back from 2020, and I know the regulations have changed since, but it's worth kind of keeping in mind, even then, how traceability was so important, and it looked to be pretty simple to bypass it. I'll change that. Okay, I'm going to change gears a little bit, having shared with you some examples where traceability is super important, but the supply chain as a whole failed. Those examples that I shared are not about necessarily maligning traceability, but the lesson is that traceability needs visibility, verification, and risk intelligence, if we're going to be really honest about this, right? And in that context, there's work that we and others are funding as part of the initiative by the American Frozen Food Institute towards addressing enteric virus risks in frozen berries. And for those who may not be aware, there have been problems with enteric viruses, norovirus, Hep A, in frozen berries from different origins. There have been foodborne illness outbreaks, recalls, but there's also been some concern that some of the recalls instigated by, or instigates, maybe a bad choice of words, required by regulators may have been due to false positives, right? And so it creates huge costs and huge food waste, right, on top of it. That being said, there are folks in industry, again, especially from an American perspective, where we're looking to move liability as far upstream as possible, right? How do you protect yourself? Well, there are voices in industry who've said, look, we'll buy the product, but once it's imported, it's got to be subject to end product testing, right? And yeah, that's expensive, but there are weaknesses with end product testing for this type of issue. I certainly don't want to leave anyone with the impression that I don't think end product testing is important, but for this particular issue, there are challenges with end product testing. Right? The nature of enteric virus is such that when you do have an issue, it's not going to be spread out through the entire shipment. It's going to be really stuck in different clusters, right? And that means you could have a shipment that maybe has enteric virus somewhere in it, and you test product, you're not going to find it necessarily. So that positive test may not really be as informative as you think it'd be, right? So a negative test does not necessarily prove safety. The testing protocols that are currently used also, can lead to false positives. You may have DNA that's left over of dead virus. I'm not saying anyone wants to have dead virus in the raspberries, right? I'm not condoning that. And again, I'm not a scientist, but I'm just telling you that from the epidemiologists who have been working on this, that's an issue of false positives by the current testing methodology. And testing in this context is reactive and it's late, right? Because the issue isn't taking place in transportation. It's not taking place, I won't say zero, but I think it's a pretty darn low risk of this happening in a cold storage, right? There is a possibility certainly in processing, but I think it may be safe to say that the biggest risk factor for enteric virus contamination is going to be at the farm level, right? I'm not totally discounting processing, but that's probably the cause. So this is a slide from the American Frozen Food Institute. It says basically the same thing, and I want to share with you the work that they've done in this in space to traceability, but also within a visibility perspective to hopefully seek some input from you guys on what you think. So this again outlines the issue with the frozen berry supply chain, limited visibility. For those of you who are aware of that type of a supply chain, in many instances, berries don't come from necessarily large farms. There could be a lot of collection of small farms. They'll go to a processor, possibly some intermediary. They'll be imported, right? There'll be a distributor, go to a retailer, and that's by no means the only way that those berries enter into the supply chain. But they do pose very specific risks. We all like our smoothies, right? And frozen berries are generally thought of as an RTE item. I don't want to get into the politics of RTE and definitions and all that, but basically, folks will take frozen kale and they'll toss it into a smoothie, right? No kill step necessarily. They'll take frozen fruit. You're not going to boil your raspberries before you make a smoothie, right? That's just not what consumers expect to do. So there is that added challenge. And of course, as we delve into the space, looking at countries with endemic populations and endemic risk factors for enteric viruses, et cetera, et cetera. So this again outlines some of the public health concerns that many of you will no doubt already be familiar with more than myself. But the line that AFI has here is that berry testing becomes a proxy for control and questions whether that's really appropriate. So AFI has put together something called eViews. It's not necessarily revolutionary. Many of you may have piloted similar ideas around getting greater visibility in the supply chain and getting data. I'm not a salesperson, right? I'm not looking to sell you this product, but full transparency, our company and others are funding this, but we have no other financial incentive in this, right? So if you found this interesting, I wouldn't know how to even sell it to you because I'm not here to sell it to you, okay? Just want to be fully transparent. So what this program is looking to do and how it's been rolling out, yes, it's an AI, digital enabled predictive modeling system, AI, right? Who hasn't heard of that before? But what's interesting is the proactive data collection and analysis that happens upstream and from the farms themselves. It includes algorithms that will look for early warning indicators to catch risks of enteric viruses upstream so that something can be done about it. You know, finding something and then doing something about it are two different things, right? If you have a product that has a berry that poses an enteric virus risk, right? Instead of just throwing it out, which would be just hugely wasteful, can it be repurposed? Is there an avenue to direct it to a kill step, right? Could it be suitable for jam production? I don't know. You folks would know better than I would. But at least giving the upstream parties that option versus a massive claim for product that may or may not actually pose a human health risk could be beneficial for a variety of reasons. So what does it really look like? What am I talking about? Well, this is what's in place right now, and I'm not going to say it's perfect. This is still something in evolution. This system sees certain stakeholders either providing data or providing data and accessing data or only accessing data. And that includes the grower, right? We're talking growers, we're talking in Chile and Mexico. And I know the obvious question you're all going to ask. That sounds nice in theory, but what about issues around trust in the supply chain and self-reporting data? Yeah, it's an issue, right? How do you work with farmers to share data that actually may be negative, right? Do you just do that under punishment, right? No, it takes a different approach to the supply chain. And this is where I'm going to get a little touchy-feely about supply chain, okay? In development circles, there's this concept around sustainability and sustainability neo-colonialism. A big word, a lot of baggage around it, right? But what does that mean? And this is sustainability circles. In its extreme form, that sees well-meaning folks from the global north, right? Really well-meaning, devising sustainability initiatives and requirements, but doing so without ever inviting folks from the global south to the table, right? And having decided on what those metrics will be, what those requirements will be, what those audits will be, then you tell your global south suppliers, if you want to have the privilege of selling to me, you've got to do this. It's going to cost you a whole lot of money. Oh, and I'm not giving you a dime. And I'm not going to help you do it. But if you want to do it, you're going to have to comply, right? That's at the extreme form. That's not entirely alien from what we see in some circles in food safety, right? Where we've devised some sort of requirement, and we're going to tell somebody in our supply chain, often the weakest party in the supply chain with the least amount of financial resources, right? You have to do this if you want the privilege of selling to us, right? And then we're surprised when corners get cut, right? This requires a different approach. And I know as food safety professionals, we don't always necessarily have the keys to the purse, so to speak, in being able to just provide money everywhere, but we do have expertise. And I think there's an opportunity increasingly for the food safety professionals in our industry to engage in areas like foreign food safety capacity building, right? Instead of just sending a foreign supplier yet another 37-page questionnaire that's only slightly different from the 12 others they've received in the last 6 months from 8 different suppliers, right? How can you help them to be compliant, right? That's an ongoing issue because as businesses, we also suffer from the same problem other businesses do, right? Except in the food industry, our margins aren't all that big, right? So, I chuckle when I receive stuff like, dear valued vendor, you know you're about to get hosed, right? Dear valued vendor, without consulting with you, we've decided that food safety is actually important, and we really want to use this documentation platform, right? And while we've never asked you to contribute to pay for our forklifts, we're not going to pay for the food safety platform. You have to send us your documents to that platform, and you've got to pay an annual fee to help pay for it. And when I see that, even though the fees can be nominal, I think that says something a little bit about food safety culture, right? You don't expect your vendors to help contribute to your forklifts, but you expect them to help contribute to the software you need for food safety visibility, right? Maybe I'm just being a little bit, high on my horse on that. Or the one I really like, especially for smaller companies, is when you get one of these Dear Valued Vendor notices. Dear Valued Vendor, we've decided to advise you of this new exciting opportunity. We're going to move you from the current 30-day pay cycle we have you on to 120 days. Because your ability to shoulder the invoices we're not paying is part of your business acumen. And as part of this exciting opportunity, we've partnered with financial institution X to give you this introductory low interest rate that you can pay to finance the receivables that we're not paying you. Oh, and when RFP season comes around, don't expect you to get the business because if somebody's a tenth of a penny cheaper, they'll get the business, right? That's not an uncommon business issue that I think a lot of food safety folks may not be necessarily aware of. I don't want to leave you the impression that this eViews thing is perfect, but it sets in motion an opportunity to work collaboratively with supply chain stakeholders. The extra data set that's being added includes public health data, triangulating issues around precipitation to see other risk factors that can be put into it. And I'm coming close to time, so I want to kind of catch up. So I'm being maybe a little unfair with what the current status is, but it's not uncommon for, some people do nothing as importers for food safety oversight. Let's just be honest, right? Others will rely on fantastic GFSI third-party audits, great, love them, and maybe some buyer audits and visits, right? And maybe some other things, right? What eView hopes to do is be able to expand that with all of this, including adding health monitoring to that platform, and as I mentioned, rain and regional flooding issues. I don't want to talk about flooding. There certainly have been issues, right? Some of the peeling back the onion and stuff that you would all basically know, but we've only further validated. In a lot of the countries where these berries come from, vaccinations are minimal. Glove use is extensive, that's great, but training's pretty poor, right? And of course, self-reporting and data trust concerns continue. I kind of went a little bit off on the trust part, but trust is built by working with suppliers, not just imposing your will upon them. And if we're not willing to do that, we're not going to get the visibility that we want to achieve. So I'm going to kind of jump ahead and talk about compliance should not be a competitive disadvantage, right? When the SFCA was put forward, there were a lot of voices here in Canada that, and I'm going to get myself in a bit of trouble potentially, but there were voices who said, hey, food safety cannot be a source of competitive advantage. That's crass. And morally, ethically, I get that, right? But what's the reality? There are folks who aren't complying now, and they're at a competitive advantage compared to folks who are doing all the right things. Is that fair? And should CFI treat them the same way? I was happy to hear this morning the reality that if you are a supplier in good standing, a Canadian manufacturer in good standing, and you haven't had issues, and this is not our first time visiting you, well, maybe the inspector will have a flexible approach in how they work with you versus if you're someone they've never seen before. That's positive, right? At the same time, what is CFI finding? Many of you will no doubt be aware that CFI is kind of taking a different approach to SFCR licensing renewals, right? They're asking questions, right? I can tell you firsthand as an importer, whenever we've renewed our SFCR license, it's a mere check-the-box exercise. You got a written PCP, check the box. You promised to pay your annual license fee or whatever it is because you got an account, great. 48 hours later, boom, you've got an SFCR license. That's it, no questions, right? Kind of makes you wonder what the power of the license is, especially when importers on their email signatures will say, hey, we're a CFI licensed company. Whoop-de-doo if you're an importer, right? It ain't rocket science to click a box, right? What CFI is finding now is when they're asking license holders, they're finding situations, and this is directly from CFI doing presentations, where they've gone to, the example they give is a domestic vegetarian mimosa manufacturer, only to find out that it's full of poultry, and they don't have the poultry controls in place, right? Well, that certainly puts their competition, who's doing the right thing, it puts them at a cost disadvantage. And they've given examples of an importer who's been importing for a long time, has a license, and when they actually looked at the PCP, they're not doing anything, all these years later. And when asked about it, what CFI stated is that the importer said, well, the exporting country didn't stop it, and CBSA, Canada Customs, didn't deny it entry, must be compliant. That's the level of oversight that company is doing. And I guarantee you that company has competitors that are doing everything they're supposed to do at tremendous cost, and in the marketplace, there's no differentiation, right? Is that fair, right? I think the other problem with that is if we're not able to use an avenue to externally communicate, it's all well and good for CFI to have internal risk scores, right? But if we're not able to somehow see external variables being shared, then there's no opportunity for market dynamics to reward folks who are compliant. And I know I'm just over time, but I want to share with you this concept. Sadly, I won't get into what happened in 2010. You'll have to hit me up later. There is a precedent for what I'm about to share with you. In the United States, the Food and Drug Administration has a trusted food importer program, the Voluntary Qualified Importer Program. Now, I'd be happy to get into a big ranging discussion about its overall success, but as a concept, it works really well. It sees the US Food and Drug Administration offering benefits and different treatment to highly compliant importers versus everybody else, right? That's what Customs does with all these AEO programs, right? Given where we are, and given the need to ensure that our CFIA is successful, would now not be a great time to consider looking at how we might be able to set up a trusted food importer program? What would that criteria look like, right? Was a bit of a downer. So last point, traceability is the record of movement. Visibility is a basis for prevention. Verification tells us whether controls are real. And in the end, food safety performance should matter, and we ought to be able to demonstrate that for commercial purposes. Thank you for your time. I know it went a little over, but we still have a minute and 45 seconds, I think, for questions. If anyone wants to rake me over the coals or be friendly. No, we're good? Oh.
I have a question regarding the berries, like traceability. So usually in commodities, they have like small farms and they all get consolidated at one place. So how did you make sure that they are also doing traceability and it is entered?
It's a fantastic question, and you've nailed like a key problem in that supply chain. So what we did and what others did, first of all, we financed this whole initiative, because obviously there's a lot of work happening behind the scenes with the software and everything else, right? And then we went to our suppliers and told them, look, this is gonna be net beneficial for you. It's not our imposing our will. We want you to be part of this. Because if you're part of this, you know, it may actually reap some rewards down the road, because we're actually talking to FDA about seeing if this could be accepted as a factor in looking at approving supply chains. And, you know, enlightened folks do exist everywhere. And so we've had some of our foreign suppliers who have also contributed to this. They in turn have worked with their farmers, right? Now, I'm not naive to think that everyone's gonna, you know, hold hands, sing kumbaya, and be on the same page, right? So it does take some leadership up the supply chain, all the way back to the farm, and providing with those folks with an opportunity to understand what the objective is. Those that get it want to be part of it. They want to continue doing business, you know, to the United States especially. Those who don't, right? So I know it's not a great answer, it's not very satisfying, but it is the world we live in. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Thank you for the presentation. It was very informative. My name is Dinesh, and I'm from Coca-Cola. We just went through an NOP audit for an organic product that is exported to US.
Yes.
And this, you must be familiar, this rule came up 3 years ago, and there was a scramble to get the, not the manufacturer, but actually the importer to get audited. My question to you is, what's your experience from the auditing company that does this audit, because their module or their auditing questions mostly deal with the manufacturing location, but not the actual importer of record. So most of the questions they're asking is based on the manufacturing, you know, what do they do in the transportation and those kind of things. So just to like to get your thoughts on how you dealt with this and how to go forward.
Yeah, it's another fantastic question. You know, the certifiers are also going through a learning curve, right? That organic importer is a brand new regulated party, right? So they're going through a learning curve, right? I think certifiers do their best, but there can be challenges, right? Not to avoid answering your question, but I want to just add this on as a concept. One of the challenges we've seen in certain parts of the world is under the NOP, you know, you can have a blanket certificate for a period of time, or you can have a shipment-specific NOP certificate. I've run across some certifiers in different parts of the world where their explanation as to why they wouldn't give a blanket certificate kind of doesn't hold water. And I wouldn't be surprised if it has more to do with the fact that they are businesses, and you can charge more for certificates if you issue 10 certificates versus 1, right? I'm not saying all certifiers, but there is that reality. To answer your question, what I've run across are situations where certifiers just need an extra bit of education in a collaborative way because it is a brand new territory. When I've been really stuck, I've reached out to the USDA. There's somebody at the head of USDA, Director of Trade, who's a former US Customs person, and he understands trade. So when I've needed to escalate something, that's what I've done, right? But you're quite correct. In the early period that we're still in, I think a lot of certifiers are doing their best in Canada. It is challenging because I know companies that are in Canada that have been certified to the, not core, but to NOP, so that the Canadian company can be the US organic importer. It's a little convoluted, but that's how it works right now. And I'll leave you with this last thought. That also may change. USDA hasn't said anything about this, but I wouldn't be surprised if they end up being massively influenced by President Trump's executive order of June 3rd, executive order 14411, engaging in greater US customs enforcement. And as written, if it doesn't change, it will completely get rid of non-resident importers. It specifically states in the executive order that it wants to discriminate. That's a pretty big word. It wants to discriminate between US IORs and foreign IORs, right? And that's going to be something that's going to be problematic, I think, for a lot of supply chains, and it could change how NOP is dealt with in the future. I'm not saying they've said that, but it's something to look out for. I think we've got some other folks coming in. We're good? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to end our conversation. I really enjoyed it, especially because I'm so caffeinated, but respectful of the other speakers. So thank you all for your time.